The Salem Witch Trials, 1692, Massachusetts. It began with whispers in the dark, little girls screaming that invisible spirits were clawing at their skin. Within months, neighbors were accusing neighbors, families were torn apart, and innocent people were dying in the name of God. This wasn't a movie, it was real. This was Salem, 1692, where fear became deadly. It started with whispers and ended in flames. In the freezing winter of 1692, deep within the snow-covered hills of Salem Village, Massachusetts, life moved slowly and quietly. The villagers were Puritans, strict, religious settlers who believed the world was divided sharply between good and evil, God and the devil. They prayed daily, worked hard, and trusted that following the rules of the church would keep them safe. But that winter, safety vanished. It began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the town's minister. His small wooden house stood near the edge of the forest, a place the villagers already feared. They believed the woods were filled with dark spirits and unknown dangers. Inside that home, on cold nights when the wind howled through the cracks, Reverend Parris's young daughter Betty, only 9 years old, would sit by the fire listening to stories told by Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who lived in the household. Tituba spoke of magic, omens, and strange spirits, stories from her homeland that fascinated the girls but also planted seeds of imagination and fear. Betty and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams would listen with wide eyes, half terrified, half enchanted. Then one morning, everything changed. Betty began to scream uncontrollably, twisting her arms, crying out that something invisible was pinching her. Abigail soon followed. She barked like a dog, crawled under furniture, and shouted words no one understood. The girls seemed to be in pain, their bodies jerking as if pulled by unseen hands. The frightened reverend didn't know what to do. He prayed, fasted, and begged God for answers. But nothing worked. Finally, in desperation, he called for the village doctor, William Griggs. After examining the girls and finding no physical illness, Dr. Griggs delivered the words that would soon drown Salem in terror. "This is not sickness. This is the work of witchcraft." Those words echoed through the village like thunder. The people of Salem were already uneasy, bad harvests, disputes over property, and harsh winters had made life difficult. Now, with the doctor's chilling diagnosis, every worry turned into suspicion. Fear took hold of the town like frost spreading across glass. Neighbors began whispering. Who had cursed the minister's children? Who was worshipping Satan in secret? Could it be the widow who lived alone at the edge of town? The beggar woman who muttered to herself? The servant who looked at you too long without speaking? Nothing seemed impossible anymore. Inside the church, Reverend Parris thundered from the pulpit, warning that the devil was walking among them, that he had chosen Salem as his battleground. People began praying harder, watching each other, and searching for signs of the devil's work in every shadow. Meanwhile, the number of afflicted girls grew. Others began to act strangely too, and Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, Mercy Lewis, all claimed to feel the same invisible torment. They screamed that specters or ghostly spirits were attacking them. They described being bitten, choked, and stabbed by unseen forces. And they began to see faces of people they knew. Under pressure from fearful adults and ministers demanding answers, the girls started naming names. They pointed to those who frightened them, those who were different, those who didn't fit the strict mold of Puritan life. The first name they spoke was Tituba, the enslaved woman whose stories had once entertained them. Then came Sarah Good, a homeless woman who begged for food, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. Each accusation sent a shock through the community. The villagers who once worked side by side now crossed the street to avoid each other. Friendships ended overnight. Families locked their doors. When the accused women were brought to court, the spectacle was horrifying. The afflicted girls screamed and writhed whenever the supposed witches entered the room. Judges, priests, and neighbors looked on in disbelief and fear. How could they argue with what they saw before their eyes? Girls collapsing, shouting that invisible hands were clawing at them. And when Tituba, frightened and desperate, confessed under pressure, she told a story that sealed the town's fate. She said the devil had visited Salem. She said he forced her to sign his book, a dark book filled with other names. That confession confirmed everyone's worst nightmare. If Tituba spoke the truth, there were many witches hiding among them. By the time the snow melted and spring arrived, Salem was no longer a peaceful Puritan village. It was a place of fear, of suspicion, of neighbors spying on neighbors and children accusing adults. What began as whispers in the minister's house had grown into a storm of paranoia that would soon consume an entire community, leading to the most infamous witch hunt in American history. And as the people of Salem prayed for salvation, the devil they feared might not have been in the forest after all. He might have been inside their own hearts. The girls, trembling and terrified, or perhaps, deep down, enjoying the strange power they now held, began to whisper names. Names of those they claimed had bewitched them. The first accusations fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of fear through every heart in Salem. They pointed to Tituba, the enslaved woman from Reverend Parris's household. Her stories of magic, once just late-night tales by the fire, now became evidence of devilish influence. Then came Sarah Good, a poor beggar woman who wandered from door to door asking for bread, muttering to herself when turned away. And Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely came to church, often ill and alone, became the third accused. 3 women, each powerless in their own way, now stood at the center of Salem's terror. Word spread faster than wind. By the next morning, the entire village buzzed with rumors. People gathered outside the meeting house, whispering, pointing, wondering who would be next. In a place where faith ruled every moment of life, being accused of witchcraft was worse than death. It meant you were believed to be a servant of Satan himself. When the accused were finally brought before the judges, the scene was chaos. The small wooden courtroom overflowed with villagers. Men stood on benches, mothers clutched their children, and ministers prayed aloud. The air was heavy with fear and sweat. The accused women were dragged in, their hands tied tightly with rope, faces pale, eyes wide in disbelief. They looked out at their neighbors, their friends, their churchmates, and saw only hatred staring back. Then came the girls, the supposed victims. They sat in a line, trembling, their voices quivering as they described being tormented by invisible shapes. They screamed that Sarah Good's ghost had bitten them, that Sarah Osborne had sent her spirit to choke them, that Tituba had flown through the night sky with demons. Every word they spoke made the crowd gasp. The judges asked each accused woman to confess and beg for forgiveness, but all 3 denied the charges. They wept, swore upon the Bible, begged for mercy. And then, it was Tituba's turn. Under intense questioning, surrounded by angry faces, Tituba realized that no amount of truth could save her. She was an enslaved woman in a Puritan town. No one would believe her innocence. The more she denied it, the more the crowd shouted that the devil was speaking through her silence. Finally, trembling and terrified, she broke. Yes, she confessed. But not to what they expected. Her confession poured out in a storm of wild, terrifying imagery. She spoke of a tall man dressed all in black who came to her at night. He had a great book, she said, and in that book were written the names of witches who had signed their souls away. The devil himself, she claimed, demanded she serve him, and that there were others in Salem who had already joined his dark cause. The courtroom fell silent, then erupted in panic. Her story was all the proof they needed. If the devil's book held more names, then witches were everywhere, hidden among them, disguised as neighbors, friends, even family. Tituba's confession, born of fear, sealed Salem's fate. From that moment, there was no turning back. The town's leaders declared war against witchcraft. The ministers spoke from the pulpit with fire in their eyes, urging everyone to remain vigilant. They said Satan was testing Salem, and that only faith, confession, and purification could drive him out. People began to watch each other closely. Every argument, every illness, every odd look suddenly seemed suspicious. A cow that refused to give milk, a child that fell sick, a storm that ruined the crops, all were blamed on witchcraft. Suspicion became a weapon. A neighbor who disliked you could whisper your name, and by morning you would be dragged from your home. Wives accused husbands, children pointed at parents, and once respected elders were branded as servants of the devil. The more names the girls cried out, the more powerful they became. Their tears and screams were treated as truth itself, and anyone who dared question them risked being accused next. By spring, the accusations had spread beyond Salem village into nearby towns. Panic rolled like thunder through Massachusetts. Everywhere, people looked over their shoulders, wondering who might betray them next. The church, meant to be a refuge, became a courtroom of fear. The ministers prayed not for mercy, but for victory over witches. In just a few weeks, Salem had turned from a quiet, God-fearing village into a nightmare of paranoia. The devil, they believed, walked among them. But what no one realized was this. It wasn't witchcraft that had taken hold of Salem, it was hysteria. And it was only beginning. The Salem Witch Trials had begun. By now, fear ruled the village completely. It was no longer just rumor or suspicion, it was official. A special court was formed by the governor himself, called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a Latin phrase meaning to hear and determine. Its purpose? To find and punish the witches said to be hiding among the people of Salem. But there was one terrifying problem. The court did not need proof. It did not need witnesses, evidence, or even reason. Instead, it relied on something called spectral evidence. That meant if someone claimed they saw your spirit, not you, but your ghostly shape, hurting them in a dream or vision, it was accepted as truth. Imagine that. Your life could end because someone said they dreamed of you. And so, in this twisted reality, sleep itself became dangerous. A bad dream, a strange shadow, a flickering candle, any of it could turn into a death sentence for someone you knew. The first to face the gallows was Bridget Bishop, a lively woman known for her bright red clothes and outspoken personality. In a Puritan village where women were expected to be quiet, modest, and obedient, Bridget stood out like fire in the dark. She owned a tavern, laughed loudly, and wasn't afraid to speak her mind, qualities that made her a perfect target. When the girls claimed Bridget's specter had attacked them, the townsfolk gasped. It didn't matter that she had been accused of witchcraft once before and acquitted. This time, the tide of hysteria was unstoppable. In the courtroom, Bridget stood tall, her wrists bound with rope. "I am innocent," she cried. "I know nothing of witchcraft." But as she spoke, the afflicted girls screamed and twisted on the floor, clutching their throats as if invisible hands were choking them. "She's hurting us. She's sending her spirit," they wailed. The judges looked at Bridget with cold eyes. To them, her denials meant nothing. The girls' screams were considered undeniable proof. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was taken to Gallows Hill. A noose was placed around her neck as she prayed for forgiveness she did not need. When the rope tightened, her body fell, and her death became the first of many. But the panic didn't end. It grew stronger. Soon after, more people were arrested. The list of accused witches grew daily. Rebecca Nurse, a gentle, respected woman of 71 years, was next. She was known for her kindness and devotion to faith, but even that could not protect her. When she was brought before the court, hundreds signed petitions declaring her innocence. Neighbors, friends, even members of her church pleaded for mercy. But the girls screamed again, claiming her ghost had tormented them. Their performances overpowered the truth. Rebecca Nurse was found guilty and hanged. The executions became public spectacles. Families were forced to watch their loved ones die. Ministers preached that this suffering was necessary, that God demanded the witches be purged to cleanse Salem's soul. But some began to doubt. Among them was John Proctor, a strong-willed farmer known for his honesty. He openly accused the girls of lying, saying their fits were fake. "These are children playing games," he shouted. But speaking against the court was dangerous. The judges saw it as defiance, and defiance was close to witchcraft. Soon, John Proctor himself was accused. His wife, Elizabeth, was already in jail. Though many in the town respected him, his courage turned to tragedy. He was sentenced to hang. Before his execution, Proctor cried out to the crowd, "It is a lie. I am no witch. God knows I am innocent." His words echoed through the valley, but no one dared to listen. The people had become prisoners of their own fear. By the time the sun set on that grim summer, dozens of innocent men and women filled the dark, crowded jails. The air in Salem was thick with dread. Each night, villagers locked their doors, whispering prayers that their names wouldn't be the next to echo in the courtroom. No one trusted anyone anymore. A mother feared her daughter's words. A husband feared his wife's dreams. Even the most devout churchgoers trembled during sermons, wondering if the person sitting beside them was secretly in league with the devil. The sound of church bells no longer meant peace, it meant another soul condemned. The wind that swept across the village carried with it cries of grief, prayers of the innocent, and the whispered question that haunted everyone. Who will be next? By autumn, Salem was no longer a town, it was a stage for terror. And though the villagers believed they were fighting the devil, the truth was far darker. The evil they hunted wasn't hiding in the woods or flying through the night sky. It was right there, inside their own hearts, fueled by fear, ignorance, and blind faith. By the fall of 1692, the madness had reached its peak. Salem was drowning in its own fear. The once quiet Puritan village had become a town of gallows, chains, and tears. The smell of burning wax from nightly prayers mixed with the cold scent of death. The people who once prayed together now avoided each other's eyes in the streets. Suspicion had become a way of life. In the span of just a few months, 19 innocent people had been hanged, their bodies swinging from the wooden beams of Gallows Hill. Some were mothers. Some were farmers. Some were respected elders who had spent their entire lives serving God. Yet here they were, condemned as witches. And then came Giles Corey. He was 81 years old, a strong, stubborn farmer with a reputation for speaking his mind. When he was accused of witchcraft, Giles refused to even enter a plea. He would not say guilty, and he would not say innocent. He believed that by saying nothing, his land could not be taken from his family after his death. But silence was a crime in Salem. The court ordered a punishment unlike any other, pressing by stones. They laid Giles Corey on the ground, placed heavy slabs of rock upon his chest, and demanded a confession. With each question, more stones were added, crushing the air from his lungs. Yet he never gave in. His final words, spoken through broken ribs and bloodied lips, were simple and defiant. More weight. And then, with those words, Giles Corey died, his courage forever carved into the dark history of Salem. Even that didn't stop the hysteria. The judges and ministers had lost control. Their courtrooms were filled daily with cries of pain and prayers for mercy. The lines between truth and madness had blurred beyond recognition. Even animals were not spared. When a dog barked too loudly, villagers said it was a familiar, a witch's demon companion. 2 dogs were killed for acting witch-like. The people of Salem had become so consumed by their terror that even innocent creatures became symbols of the devil. But at last, doubt began to creep into their minds. People started whispering behind closed doors, "How could this be? How could so many good, God-fearing men and women suddenly be witches? Why were the poorest, weakest, and most vulnerable always the ones accused, while the loudest accusers gained more power and respect?" The truth was impossible to ignore. The same ministers who once demanded blood now hesitated. The same villagers who once shouted, "Witch," now stayed silent, afraid of what they had become. Then came the turning point, the moment the spell finally began to break. When Governor William Phipps's own wife was accused of witchcraft, the madness that had consumed Salem finally reached the halls of power. The governor, who had once supported the trials, suddenly saw what others had been too blind to see. If even the governor's wife could be accused, then no one was safe. Realizing the horror he had unleashed, Governor Phipps acted swiftly. He banned the use of spectral evidence, declaring that dreams, visions, and ghostly claims could no longer be accepted in court. Without those false testimonies, the foundation of the trials collapsed overnight. He then dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the same court that had sent so many to their deaths. The trials ended. The executions stopped. The remaining prisoners, many of whom had languished for months in cold, filthy cells, were finally released. They stepped out into a world that no longer trusted itself, a world forever changed. It was as if the entire town had awoken from a long, twisted nightmare. But waking up did not erase the horror of what they had done. Families were shattered. Innocent people were buried in unmarked graves. Reputations, once pure, were destroyed forever. The church, the law, the community, everything that once held Salem together, had been poisoned by fear. Some villagers wept and begged forgiveness. Others refused to admit they had done anything wrong. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Salem had killed its own. The same faith that was meant to guide them to salvation had been twisted into a weapon. And though the gallows were empty now, their shadow stretched long over the town. The people tried to move on, to rebuild their homes, their faith, and their lives. But the ghosts of the innocent lingered in every corner. Every creak of the wooden floor, every chill of the night wind, carried the unspoken question that would haunt Salem for generations. How could we let this happen? The answer was simple and terrifying. It wasn't witches that destroyed Salem. It was fear. Fear that turned friends into enemies. Fear that silenced reason. Fear that blinded faith. By the time the last prisoner walked free, the town of Salem was no longer at war with witches. It was at war with its own conscience. Years later, when the fires of hysteria had long burned out and the gallows had turned to dust, the people of Salem were left staring at the ashes of what they had done. The screams had faded, the crowds had gone home, and the silence that followed was heavier than any noose. Life tried to return to normal, but nothing was the same. The survivors carried their guilt like shadows that never lifted. Children grew up without mothers, husbands without wives, and friends without trust. Every church bell that rang reminded the town of the prayers that hadn't saved the innocent. By the early 1700s, Salem's name had become infamous. Across New England, people whispered about it, the town that killed its own in the name of God. Ministers spoke cautiously about the trials, calling them a mistake, sin of zeal. But the damage was done. In 1702, the colonial government finally admitted what so many already knew: the trials had been a tragedy of injustice. Those words were printed in official documents, a small attempt to right a massive wrong. But the pain of Salem was not something that could be erased by words. Nearly a decade later, in 1711, the government went a step further. It passed a law to restore the good names of the accused and offered financial compensation to their families. Some received money, some land, some public acknowledgement. Yet no one celebrated. How could they? How could money replace the lives that were lost to hysteria? How could a few coins repay the memory of mothers who begged for mercy, of fathers crushed under stones, of children left to wonder why their parents never came home? The truth was simple: it couldn't. The Salem Witch Trials became one of the darkest chapters in American history. A story of how fear can overpower reason, how rumors can destroy lives, and how believing without proof can lead to unimaginable horror. And though centuries have passed, the lesson of Salem has never grown old. Today, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, is no longer a place of terror. It's a symbol, a living museum of what happens when fear replaces truth. The wooden gallows are gone, replaced by cobblestone streets and candlelit tours. But the ghosts remain, not spirits of witches, but of innocence lost. Every October, when the autumn leaves turn crimson and the air smells of smoke and apples, thousands of visitors walk through Salem streets. They come to see the memorial stones engraved with the names of the victims. They come to learn, to remember, and to ask questions. They visit the house of the old meeting hall, the prison site, the witch trials memorial, quiet places where the whispers of history seem to echo in the wind. Some say the town is haunted, but the real haunting is not of ghosts in the night. It's the haunting of memory. Each year, as Halloween approaches and Salem fills with laughter, costumes, and lights, there is still an undercurrent of reflection. Beneath the celebrations lies a solemn truth. These streets once ran red with fear. The people who come here don't just seek stories of magic or witchcraft. They come to understand something deeper, something human. Because Salem's tragedy isn't really about witches at all. It's about people. People who were afraid. People who followed the crowd. People who stayed silent when they should have spoken up. And maybe that's why Salem still matters today. Every generation faces its own kind of witch hunt, moments when fear spreads faster than facts, when lies sound louder than truth, and when society turns against its own. In those moments, the ghosts of Salem rise again, not to frighten us, but to remind us. They remind us that truth must never bow to hysteria, that justice without reason is no justice at all, and that once fear is allowed to decide who's guilty, no one is truly safe. Today, as tourists walk through Salem's old graveyards, as the church bells ring softly at dusk, a question still lingers in the cool evening air. The same question that haunted the village in 1692 and still haunts the world now. What happens when society lets fear decide who's guilty? The answer lies not in the past, but in us. Because Salem is not just a story of what once happened. It's a warning of what can happen again. Salem's story reminds us that fear can destroy what truth builds. In 1692, innocent lives were taken in the name of faith. But today, their voices still whisper a warning. Never let fear decide who's guilty. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the darkness hidden in history.